The auctioneer's chant was a hypnotic rhythm under the relentless July sun of '76. It was a language all its own, a staccato mix of numbers and filler words that separated men from their money with surgical precision. Frank Miller stood near the back, by a rusty hay rake that nobody wanted, his arms crossed over his chest. He wasn't here to buy, not really. He was here to watch, to feel the pulse of the county. And right now, the pulse was racing. The crowd was thick around the centerpiece of the auction, a machine that looked like it belonged on the moon. It was a Steiger Panther II, brand new, its lime green paint so bright it hurt the eyes. 4 massive dual tires held up an articulated body that bent in the middle like some prehistoric beast. The cab was a glass box, a palace compared to the open station tractors Frank was used to. It had air conditioning, a radio, maybe even a tape deck. It was the future, and it was being sold today. Frank watched Dale Peterson work the crowd. Dale was 35, but he had the swagger of a man who'd already conquered the world. His shirt was clean, his jeans were creased, and his smile was a weapon. He moved from one knot of farmers to another, clapping shoulders, laughing a little too loud, his voice carrying over the auctioneer's drone. He was talking about expansion, about leverage, about how you had to get big or get out. The bank president, Mr. Harrison, stood beside him, nodding like a priest at a sermon. Dale spotted Frank leaning against the hay rake and sauntered over, a smirk already playing on his lips. "Well, look what the cat dragged in. Frank Miller. You here to pick up a coffee can full of rusty bolts?" Dale chuckled. Frank just gave a slow nod. "Mornin', Dale. Just watching the show." "This ain't a show, Frank. This is progress," Dale said, gesturing with a sweep of his arm toward the giant Steiger. "That machine right there will plow 160 acres before you can get that old deer of yours started. You can't compete with that kind of efficiency." Frank's prize tractor was a 1968 John Deere 4020, a side console model he'd bought used 5 years ago. It was clean, the engine was tight, and he knew every bolt and wire on it. It was his, paid for in cash. "My 4020 does just fine for what I need," Frank said, his voice low and even. "What you need?" Dale scoffed. "Frank, you're farming the same 120 acres your daddy farmed. The world's moved on. Land prices are going up. Grain prices are through the roof. A man's a fool not to borrow every dime the bank will give him and buy up every acre he can get his hands on. That's how you build an empire. I'm not looking to build an empire, Dale, just looking to make a living and sleep at night." Dale shook his head with a pitying look. "You can't sleep your way to prosperity. You're sitting on a gold mine with your land, all paid off and free and clear. It's lazy money. You should be using that equity, leveraging it. Mr. Harrison here," he said, nodding toward the banker. "He understands. He's not just my banker, he's my partner." Frank looked past Dale to the banker, who gave a tight professional smile. Frank had known Harrison's father, a man who wouldn't lend you a nickel without a handshake and a hard look at your character. The son was different. He dealt in numbers, in projections, in risk calculated on a sheet of paper. The auctioneer's voice rose to a crescendo, focusing all attention back on the Steiger. "I got 48,000. Now who'll give me 49? 49. Make it $49,000, boys. You won't see another one like it this year." The bidding, which had been a flurry of nods and raised fingers from around the crowd, slowed. It was down to 2 men. Then one of them shook his head and stepped back. A hush fell. "Sold," the auctioneer yelled, his hammer cracking down on the podium. "For $48,500 to Mr. Dale Peterson." A wave of applause and impressed whistles rippled through the crowd. Dale raised his hand in a victory salute, beaming as he shook Mr. Harrison's hand. He'd just spent more on one tractor than Frank's entire farm was worth, and he'd done it with the bank's money. As the crowd began to disperse, Dale walked past Frank one last time. "You see that, old man?" he said, his voice dripping with condescension. "That's the sound of the future. You ought to listen up. Your museum pieces belong in a scrapyard." Frank didn't say a word. He just watched Dale climb up into the cab of his new green monster. He watched him fire up the massive Cummins diesel, which rumbled to life with a deep-throated roar that vibrated in Frank's chest. He watched him drive it off the auction line, a king on his new throne. Driving his old Ford F-250 home, the one his father had bought new in '67, Frank thought about Dale's words. Museum pieces. Scrapyard. The world was changing so fast. Men like Dale were the new heroes, the risk-takers, the gamblers betting the farm on the belief that the good times would never end. And men like Frank, who valued a paid-for deed over a new coat of paint, were being called fools. He drove past his own neat fence rows, the corn standing tall and even, a testament to a lifetime of careful work. He felt a deep-seated stubbornness rise in him, a quiet refusal to be swept away by the tide of easy credit and loud ambition. Before we get into what happened next, I have to ask you folks listening, have you ever known a man like Dale? The kind who borrows his way to the top, thinking the music will never stop playing. Or maybe you knew a man like Frank, quiet and steady, who the whole town counted out. Let me know down in the comments, because I bet every small town in America had one of each back in those days. The first sign of trouble came not as a thunderclap, but as a whisper. It was late April of the following year, a wet, cold spring that had everyone on edge. Frank was trying to get his corn in the ground. He was out on the 40/20, pulling his 6-row John Deere 7000 planter. The diesel engine sang its familiar, powerful song, a throaty baritone that Frank knew as well as his own breathing. But something wasn't right. The planter felt sluggish, lifting at the end of the rows. The hydraulics were whining, a high-pitched complaint that set his teeth on edge. He finished the pass, pulled the tractor onto the headland, and shut it down. The sudden silence was filled with the chirping of red-winged blackbirds in the ditch. He climbed down from the seat, his boots sinking into the soft black soil. The smell of diesel and damp earth was the perfume of his life's work. He ran a hand along the warm green hood of the tractor, a gesture of reassurance for both man and machine. He checked the hydraulic fluid level. It was fine. The fluid itself looked clean, no milky tint of water contamination. He climbed back up and started the tractor again, working the hydraulic lever. The 3-point hitch rose slowly, painfully, shuddering under the weight of the planter. It was the pump. He knew it in his gut. It was starving for oil, or it was just plain worn out. Back in the shop, he began the slow, methodical process of diagnosis. The shop was his sanctuary, a place of order and purpose. Wrenches hung in perfect silhouette on the pegboard wall, sockets were arranged by size in their metal trays. The air smelled of grease, steel, and old coffee. He drained the hydraulic fluid first, a stream of amber oil into a clean 5-gallon bucket. Then he pulled the filter screen from the transmission case. It was clean. That ruled out a simple blockage. It had to be the main pump. On a 40/20, the main hydraulic pump is tucked away on the right side of the transmission housing, a heavy, gear-driven chunk of cast iron. Getting to it was a job. He disconnected the lines, carefully plugging each one with a clean rag to keep dirt out. The fittings were tight, frozen by years of work and weather. He put a long cheetah pipe on his wrench, leaned into it with all his weight, and felt the satisfying crack as the fitting broke loose. One by one, he undid the mounting bolts. The last one was a bear to get to, hidden behind a tangle of linkages. He had to use a universal joint and an extension on his socket wrench, feeling for the bolt head by touch alone. His knuckles were scraped raw by the time it was free. The pump was heavy, maybe 40 pounds. He wrestled it out and carried it over to the workbench, setting it down on a clean piece of cardboard. It was coated in a layer of oily grime. He spent the next hour cleaning it, first with a putty knife to scrape off the thickest gunk, then with a can of kerosene and a stiff brush until the original John Deere green paint showed through in spots. With the pump clean, he began the disassembly. He didn't have a manual, not a paper one anyway. The manual was in his head, learned from years of fixing his own equipment. He knew that inside this cast iron housing was a set of precisely machined gears that created the hydraulic pressure to run everything from the power steering to the 3-point hitch. He carefully removed the end plate. Inside, the gears were slick with oil. He inspected their teeth. They looked good, no chips or excessive wear, but when he examined the housing itself, he saw it. A faint, almost invisible scoring mark on the inner wall, a tiny channel where high-pressure fluid had been leaking past the gears, bleeding off the power. The pump was losing its efficiency, worn out from 100,000 lifts of a plow, a disc, a planter. He drove his Ford into town to the John Deere dealership. The parts counter was run by a man named George who'd been there since the place opened. "Hydraulic pump for a 4020 giving you fits, Frank?" George asked without even looking up from his catalogue. "She's getting tired, George. Whining more than the widow Johnson. I can order you a whole new unit. Be here in 2 days. Most fellas just swap 'em out now. Easier that way." "Easier costs more," Frank said. "I just need a gasket kit and a new set of pressure seals, and see if you can get me the wear plates for the inside." George nodded, a flicker of respect in his eyes. "Knew you'd say that. You and your dad, always rebuilding, never replacing. Let me see what I got in the back." While George was gone, Frank walked over to the coffee pot in the corner. A group of farmers were huddled there, talking shop. He recognized their voices before he saw their faces. "Saw Dale Peterson's new rig yesterday," one was saying. "That Steiger pulled a 40-foot field cultivator like it was a garden rake. Said he worked till midnight, got all his ground worked ahead of this rain. Heard he bought the old Henderson place too," another added. "Paid cash, they say." "Nah, no one pays cash for land anymore," the first one countered. "Bank's backing him all the way. Harrison's betting the farm on him, you might say." They all chuckled. Then one of them, a younger man named Bill, lowered his voice. Saw Frank Miller heading into town. His 4020 was parked out on the headland. Looked like he was broke down again. "Poor guy. Can't get ahead turning a wrench all day." Frank poured his coffee, his back to them. He didn't let on that he'd heard. He just stood there, stirring the black liquid in the styrofoam cup, the words echoing in his mind. Broke down again. Can't get ahead. They saw his careful maintenance as a sign of failure. His refusal to go into debt as a sign of fear. George returned with a small cardboard box. "Got your seals and gaskets, Frank. No wear plates in stock, but the ones you got are probably fine if you lap 'em flat on a piece of glass with some valve-grinding compound." "That's what I figured," Frank said, taking the box. He paid in cash, thanked George, and walked out without another word to the men by the coffee pot. The rain started that night, a slow, soaking drizzle that turned into a steady downpour. It lasted for 3 days, 3 perfect planting days. Lost. From his kitchen window, Frank could see across the valley to Dale Peterson's land. It was all planted. The neat black rows were a testament to speed and power. Frank's fields remained brown and waiting. The doubt crept in again, a cold whisper in the back of his mind. Maybe they were right. Maybe he was just a stubborn old fool, polishing brass on a sinking ship. He spent those 3 rainy days in the shop. He meticulously lapped the pump's internal plates until they were perfectly smooth. He installed the new seals, his fingers deft and sure. He retapped a mounting bolt hole where the threads had gotten a little weak. He reassembled the pump, torqued every bolt to spec, and painted it John Deere green, just because that was the right way to do it. When the sun finally broke through the clouds, Frank was ready. He mounted the rebuilt pump on the 4020, connected the lines, and filled the transmission with fresh high-guard fluid. He climbed into the seat, took a deep breath, and turned the key. The diesel engine roared to life. He let it warm up, then eased the hydraulic lever back. The planter rose from the ground, smooth, fast, and silent. Not a shudder, not a whine. It lifted with the quiet authority of a perfectly functioning machine. A slow smile spread across Frank's face. It was a private victory, a satisfaction that no bank loan could ever buy. He put the tractor in gear and drove out to the field, ready to finish the job. The next few years were a blur of golden prosperity for American agriculture. The grain deals with the Soviets in the early 70s had sent prices soaring. Corn was over $3 a bushel. Beans were pushing $7. Land that had sold for $500 an acre was suddenly worth $2,000, then $3. Inflation was running hot, but for farmers with something to sell, it felt like a boom time. The talk in the coffee shop was no longer about the weather. It was about interest rates, tax shelters, and expansion. Dale Peterson rode the crest of that wave like he was born to it. He was no longer just a farmer, he was an agribusinessman. The $48,000 Steiger was just the beginning. He bought another one, a bigger one, a Tiger III with even more horsepower. He bought the Henderson place, then the old Miller farm down the road. He was farming nearly 2,000 acres now, all of it leveraged to the hilt. A brand new Gleaner N7 combine, the biggest on the market, sat in a new machine shed that was bigger than the town's grain elevator. His wife drove a new Lincoln Continental, and Dale himself had a shiny new Silverado pickup every year. He was the poster child for the new era of farming. The farm journals wrote articles about him, praising his aggressive management style and his embrace of modern technology and finance. He was the future, they said, and men like Frank Miller were relics. One afternoon, Dale's new pickup pulled into Frank's lane, kicking up a cloud of dust. Frank was in the barn, mending a piece of harness for his small herd of cattle, a sideline that brought in steady cash. "Frank," Dale called out, his voice booming with confidence. He strode into the barn, looking out of place in his clean clothes, amidst the smell of hay and manure. "Still playing with cows, I see." "They pay the bills, Dale," Frank said, not looking up from his work. "I'm sure they do," Dale said with a patronizing tone. "Listen, Frank, I'll get right to the point. I want to buy your place, all of it, the 120. Frank finally looked up. "It's not for sale." "Everything's for sale for the right price," Dale said smoothly. "Look, I know this place has sentimental value. Your dad, your granddad, I get it. But you're working yourself to death for pennies. I'll give you $3,000 an acre. Cash. That's $360,000. You could retire, move to Florida, buy a boat. You'd never have to bust another knuckle on that old junk out there again." He gestured toward the 4020, which was parked by the shed, its paint faded but its metal sound. Frank set his leather-working tools down. "Dale, this land isn't just a number on a balance sheet to me. It's my home. It's who I am. And my equipment, it might be old, but it's mine. I don't owe a dime on any of it. That's a kind of wealth you don't seem to understand." Dale let out a short, sharp laugh. "Wealth? Frank, you're sitting on a dead asset. That money could be working for you. You're a fool if you don't take my offer. I'm going to own all the land around you eventually anyway. You'll be a little island in the middle of Peterson Farms. You might as well sell now and get a good price." "The answer is no, Dale," Frank said, his voice quiet but firm as granite. Dale's smile vanished. He shook his head in disgust. "Suit yourself, old man. Don't come crying to me when you can't make your property taxes." He turned and stormed out of the barn, slamming the door of his pickup and peeling out of the lane. Frank stood there for a long time, the smell of exhaust fumes hanging in the air. He wasn't scared. He was angry. While Dale was building his empire of debt, Frank was fortifying his small kingdom. The high grain prices were good for him too, but his response was different. He didn't buy more land. He didn't buy new iron. He used the profits to kill his debt. He paid off the last small operating loan he had at the bank. He paid off the note on his F-250. He became truly, completely, 100% debt-free. With the extra money, he invested in his farm. He put a new steel roof on the barn. He replaced the old wooden fence posts with new steel ones. He bought a brand new Lincoln arc welder for the shop, allowing him to make repairs he used to have to hire out. He put new heavy-ply tires on the 4020. Every dollar was a brick in the wall he was building around his life, a fortress of solvency. The rest of the county saw it as a failure of imagination. They saw Frank's old, clean machinery and his modest acreage, and they saw a man who was afraid to take a risk, a man who was being left behind. They didn't see the black ink in his ledger book. They didn't see the paid-in-full receipts in his file cabinet. They didn't understand that while they were all running a race, Frank was preparing for a storm. The first hint of that storm came on a Tuesday morning in the fall of '79. Frank was at the Farmers and Merchants Bank to deposit a check from the sale of his feeder calves. The bank was quiet. Mr. Harrison, the president, was in his glass-walled office, on the phone. Frank had never seen him look so grim. His face was pale, and he kept running a hand through his thinning hair. As Frank finished his transaction with the teller, Harrison hung up the phone with a clatter. He saw Frank looking at him and forced a weak smile. It didn't touch his eyes. They were filled with a kind of panic Frank had never seen in a banker before. "Morning, Frank," Harrison said, his voice strained. "Good year for cattle?" "Can't complain," Frank replied. As he turned to leave, Frank's eyes fell on the large chalkboard behind the tellers, where the bank posted its current lending rates. A new number had been chalked in next to farm operating loans. Last month it had been 9%. The month before, 8.5%. Today the number was 12%. A cold draft seemed to blow through the bank's front door, carrying the scent of burning leaves and an approaching winter. Frank looked from the number on the board to the worried face of the banker, then thought of Dale Peterson's empire, built entirely on borrowed money. He felt a deep, unsettling chill. The music, he realized, was about to stop, and most of the farmers in the county had forgotten how to find a chair. The 12% on the bank's chalkboard was a crack in the dam. By the spring of 1980, that crack had become a gaping hole. The Federal Reserve, in a desperate war against inflation, had cranked interest rates to levels that were unthinkable just a year before. The prime rate, the number that banks based their own lending on, clawed its way to 15, then 18, then an eye-watering 20%. The number on the chalkboard at the Farmers and Merchants Bank now read, Farm Operating Loans, 21%. It was no longer a loan, it was a death sentence. The talk at the coffee shop turned sour. The swagger was gone, replaced by a low hum of anxiety. Men who had been bragging about new combines a year ago were now whispering about refinancing, about selling off a back 40 to make a payment. The price of corn had stagnated, then started to fall. A Soviet grain embargo, a political move made in a distant capital, had slammed the door on a major market. The golden goose was dead. Then the sky turned against them. The summer of 1980 arrived not with gentle rains, but with a brassy, cloudless sky and a searing wind from the southwest. Day after day the sun beat down, baking the rich black soil into a cracked grey brick. The young corn plants, which should have been waist-high and dark green by July, were stunted and yellow, their leaves rolling tight into thin spears to conserve what little moisture they had. The drought was a physical manifestation of the economic despair settling over the county. Frank felt it like everyone else. His corn was suffering, his hay fields were thin, but his anxiety was different. It was the worry of a poor harvest, not the terror of foreclosure. He had no interest payments gnawing at his bottom line. His only costs were fuel, seed, and his own sweat. He watched his neighbors, especially Dale Peterson, and saw a different kind of fear in their eyes. One blistering afternoon in July, Frank was driving his old Ford home from town when he saw it. Dale's massive Steiger Tiger III, the bigger, meaner brother to his first one, was sitting silent in the middle of a half-ploughed field. It was listing to one side, like a great green beast that had been mortally wounded. Dale's shiny Silverado was parked nearby, its door flung open. Frank could see Dale pacing back and forth, gesturing wildly as he talked to a mechanic in greasy coveralls. Frank knew the mechanic, a good man named Charlie who ran the independent heavy equipment shop in the next town over. He pulled his truck over to the side of the road and walked out into the baked field. The heat rose in shimmering waves from the ground. "What's the trouble, Charlie?" Frank asked, giving a nod to Dale, who barely acknowledged him. Charlie wiped a film of sweat and dust from his forehead with the back of his hand. "It's a bad one, Frank. Real bad. The planetary hub in the left front final drive grenaded itself, took out the axle shaft and the main housing with it." Frank whistled low. He knew what that meant. The final drives were what transferred the engine's power to the massive wheels. A failure like that wasn't a simple fix. "Parts have to come from the factory in Fargo," Charlie continued, his voice grim. "They're on back order, and they're proud of them. The housing alone is over $6,000, not counting the gear set, the bearings, or the labor to put it all together. He's looking at $10,000, maybe $12,000 before it's all said and done." Dale overheard the number and threw his hands up in the air. $12,000, for what? The damn thing is only 2 years old. It's supposed to be the best. "It's a lot of iron, Dale," Charlie said patiently. "A lot of stress on those parts, pulling a 50-foot chisel plow through this hard ground. Things break." "I can't wait for parts from Fargo," Dale yelled, his voice cracking. "I've got payments to make. I've got to get this crop in." "There's nothing I can do, Dale. I can't make the parts appear out of thin air," Charlie said, starting to pack up his tools. "I'll get 'em ordered. Call you when they come in." Charlie drove off, leaving Dale alone with his crippled giant. The Steiger, once a symbol of his unstoppable ambition, now looked like a monument to his vulnerability. It was too big, too complex, too expensive. When it failed in a catastrophic way that he couldn't fix with his own 2 hands and a set of wrenches. Frank stood there for a moment. He could see the cracks forming not just in the field, but in the man himself. The easy confidence was gone, replaced by a brittle, desperate anger. "You need a hand with chores?" Frank asked quietly. Dale spun around, his face flushed. "A hand? What I need is a miracle, Frank, not advice from a man who's still farming with a museum piece. Go polish your little green tractor and leave me alone." Frank didn't say another word. He just nodded, turned, and walked back to his truck. As he drove away, he looked in his rearview mirror. Dale was standing alone in the vast, empty field, a tiny figure dwarfed by the silent, broken machine. The first crack in the empire wasn't a sound you could hear. It was the sight of a man yelling at a machine that could no longer do his bidding, powerless against the forces of steel, weather, and finance that he had mistaken for his servants. The fall of 1981 was the season the bills came due. The drought had crippled the harvest, and the price of corn fell below $2 a bushel. Land values, which had been the foundation of everyone's borrowing power, collapsed. Ground that had been appraised at $3,000 an acre struggled to find a buyer at $1,000. Bankers who had been partners in prosperity now became cold-eyed accountants, their smiles replaced with grim talk of liquidation and foreclosure. The farm crisis had arrived. It came for the good and the bad, the foolish and the hard-working. It was an indiscriminate flood, but it drowned the deepest in debt first. All over the county, the telltale signs appeared. Auction notices tacked to the bulletin board at the feed mill, strange pickups parked in neighbors' driveways, families loading their possessions into U-Haul trucks in the dead of night. The sound of the auctioneer's chant, once a rhythm of optimism and growth, became a funeral dirge. The auction at Peterson Farms was scheduled for a cold, grey Saturday in November. The whole county turned out, not with the eager energy of a bargain hunt, but with the somber curiosity of people viewing a wreck. They came to see the fall of the man who had flown higher than any of them. Frank went too. He stood near the back, just as he had at that other auction 5 years earlier, his hands in his pockets, a sad, heavy feeling in his chest. The machinery was lined up in neat, tragic rows. The giant Gleaner N7 combine, the 2 massive Steiger tractors, the fleet of brand-new trucks and wagons. They were all there, bearing the dust of the last failed harvest. Mr. Harrison, the banker, stood beside the auctioneer, his face a mask of professional detachment, but his eyes darted around nervously. This wasn't a victory for the bank. It was a desperate attempt to recover pennies on the dollar. Dale and his wife stood on the porch of their big new house, watching the proceedings as if they were strangers. Dale looked like a hollowed-out version of his former self. His shoulders were slumped, his face was pale and drawn, and the fire in his eyes had been extinguished, leaving only a dull grey ash of defeat. The bidding was brutal. The crowd was made of survivors, men who had cash but were too scared or too broke to spend it on anything but necessities. A 4-wheel drive tractor that had cost over $100,000 sold for $30,000. The N7 combine, a $250,000 machine, barely fetched $50,000. It was a bloodbath. Then they came to the first Steiger, the Panther II, the one that had started it all. It was the machine that had symbolized the future, the sound of progress. Now it just looked big and tired. The auctioneer started the bidding high. "Who'll give me $20,000 for this fine machine, boys? $20,000. Silence. The crowd just stared. 15. Give me 15,000. A hand went up hesitantly. I got 15. Now who'll give 16? The bidding stalled again. The tractor was too big for most of the remaining farms, its fuel consumption was enormous, and the parts were prohibitively expensive. It was a dinosaur from a bygone era of cheap fuel and easy credit. "Come on, boys, she's worth more than that for scrap," the auctioneer pleaded. Finally, he gave up. Sold for $15,000. Frank watched it all, feeling no sense of triumph, only a profound sadness. This wasn't just Dale's failure, it was a failure of the whole system, a dream that had turned into a nightmare. He saw men he'd known his whole life, good farmers, being stripped of their land, their equipment, their identity, all because they had believed the experts who told them to borrow and expand. Frank, meanwhile, was surviving. The drought had hurt him, but it hadn't broken him. His small herd of cattle, which he fed with his own hay, provided a steady stream of income. He sold a few calves, a few older cows, and it was enough to pay his property taxes and buy groceries. His 4020, now nearly 15 years old, still ran like a top. When the starter began to drag, he didn't call a mechanic. He took it off, drove to the auto-electric shop in town, bought a new set of brushes for $5, and rebuilt it himself on his workbench. He patched a hole in his combine's grain tank with a piece of sheet metal and a pop rivet gun. His self-sufficiency, once seen as a quaint hobby, was now his shield. While his neighbors were paralyzed by repair bills they couldn't afford, Frank kept his old iron running. He had become an island of solvency in a sea of red ink. He wasn't getting rich, but he was holding on. He was sleeping at night, and in the heart of the farm crisis, that was the only kind of wealth that mattered. The winter that followed the auction was long and bitter, a season of frozen ground and frozen credit. The news of Dale Peterson's collapse had sent a shockwave through the community. He had lost everything, the 2,000 acres, the new machinery, the big house. All of it had been swallowed by the bank. He and his family had moved into a small rental house in town, and Dale was trying to find work, but jobs were scarce. He had gone from being the king of the county to just another casualty. One evening in early spring, as a cold rain fell, Frank saw headlights turn into his lane. It was an old, beat-up sedan he didn't recognize. A man got out and walked slowly toward the porch light. It was Dale. He looked older, thinner. The expensive jacket was gone, replaced by a worn work coat. Frank opened the door. "Dale, come on in out of the rain." Dale hesitated on the doorstep, dripping water onto the mat. "I won't stay long, Frank." He didn't look Frank in the eye. He just stared at the floorboards. I came to say, you were right." The words came out quiet and ragged, costing him every last ounce of his pride. All that talk, about empires and getting big, all that leverage. It was a house of cards. I built it all on sand. You built yours on rock. Frank just nodded, motioning him toward a chair at the kitchen table. "Sit down, Dale. Let me get you some coffee." Frank poured 2 mugs of coffee, the silence broken only by the sound of the rain on the tin roof. He set one in front of Dale. "I don't know what to do," Dale said, his voice barely a whisper. "I'm 40 years old. I've been farming my whole life. It's all I know. And I've got nothing. Less than nothing." Frank sat down across from him. He didn't say, "I told you so." He didn't lecture. He just listened. He saw not an antagonist, but a broken man, a neighbor who was hurting. "At the auction," Frank said finally, his voice gentle, "they sold off your dad's original quarter section, the home place." Dale nodded, his eyes filling with tears. "Yeah. Bank bought it back, got no bids, just another asset on their books. I talked to Harrison at the bank yesterday," Frank said. "I bought it." Dale looked up, his face a mixture of shock and confusion. "You? Why? I thought you weren't interested in expanding." "I'm not," Frank said. "I bought it because a man's home place shouldn't be a number in a bank's ledger. It's got history, it's got roots." He pushed his coffee cup aside and leaned forward. "I want you to rent it from me, Dale, on shares, a fair split. You farm it. You live in the old house. You start over." Dale stared at him, speechless. He opened his mouth, then closed it. The idea of working for Frank, the man he had ridiculed for years, was a humbling blow. But the offer itself, it was a lifeline. It was a chance to get his hands back in the soil, to do the work he knew, to salvage a piece of his dignity. "Why, Frank?" Dale finally managed to ask. "After everything I said, everything I did, why would you do this for me?" Frank looked out the window at his own dark fields, waiting for the spring thaw. "Because this is a community, Dale, not a competition. When a neighbor falls, you don't step on him to get ahead. You offer him a hand up. We forgot that for a while, I think. All of us. That spring, a strange sight appeared in the fields of the old Peterson home place. Dale Peterson was out there, not on a giant Steiger, but on a familiar green tractor with faded paint and new tires. Frank had bought a second tractor at a different auction, another John Deere 4020, a bit rougher than his own, but mechanically sound. He had paid cash, a fraction of what a new one would cost, and had spent the winter in his shop tuning it up. He loaned it to Dale, along with a 6-row planter and an old disc. The community watched, astonished. The man who had once commanded an army of horsepower was now farming 160 acres with a 20-year-old tractor. But there was a difference in him. The frantic energy was gone. He moved with a slow, deliberate purpose. He was learning a new kind of farming, a farming of thrift and patience. He was learning the Frank Miller way. The years passed. The farm crisis slowly receded, leaving a scarred but wiser landscape. The survivors were the ones like Frank, the farmers who had managed their debt, who knew how to fix their own machinery, who valued resilience over size. Frank never got any bigger. He was content with his 120 acres. He had proven his point not with words, but with survival. He was no longer seen as a relic. He was seen as a prophet. Younger farmers, who had seen their fathers lose everything, would stop by his shop, not to talk about the markets, but to ask how to set the timing on an old diesel engine, or how to weld a cracked frame. One warm summer afternoon, years later, Frank was out in his shop. He was an old man now, his hair white, his hands permanently stained with the grease of a lifetime. His grandson, a boy of 10 named Michael, was with him. They were leaning over the open side panel of the 4020. The boy held a flashlight while Frank adjusted the valve lash on the number 3 cylinder. "Why don't we get a new tractor, Grandpa?" Michael asked, his voice echoing slightly in the quiet shop. "Like the ones they have now, with computers and GPS?" Frank tightened a lock nut with a wrench, his movements sure and economical. He wiped his hands on a red rag before answering. "This tractor here," he said, patting the green fuel tank, "we own it. It doesn't own us. There's no banker who can come take this tractor away if we have a bad year. If it breaks," he tapped the engine block, "I can fix it. I understand it. Every bolt, every wire. That's a kind of freedom, Michael. A freedom that's more valuable than air conditioning or a fancy radio." He looked at the boy, his eyes clear and steady. "Your goal in life shouldn't be to get bigger. It should be to get stronger, strong roots. Don't ever borrow your way to the top. You build your life one piece at a time, something you can call your own. That way, when the storms come, and they always come, you'll still be standing when the sun comes out again." The boy nodded, not fully understanding the weight of the words, but sensing their importance. He would remember this lesson long after the old tractor was gone. That evening, Frank sat on his porch swing, watching the sun set over his fields of corn, which stood tall and green under a clear sky. In the distance, he could hear the faint, familiar rumble of a diesel engine. It was Dale, finishing up his cultivating on the old home place, his own son riding on the fender beside him. Dale had never expanded again. He farmed his 160 acres, made a decent living, and was slowly, carefully buying the land back from Frank, one payment at a time. The two men were more than neighbors now. They were friends, bound by a shared history of failure and forgiveness. A deep sense of peace settled over Frank. He hadn't built an empire of dirt. He hadn't chased the fleeting glory of the boom times. He had simply held on. He had kept the faith with the land, with his tools, and with himself. He had built a life, a legacy of quiet strength and stubborn independence. And as the last sliver of sun disappeared below the horizon, he knew, with a certainty that ran deeper than the roots of the oldest oak tree on his farm, that it had been enough.